On this video, we'll be learning a few dafs of Tractate Shabbat. I decided to summarize the first few dafs until the end of the first Mishnah, the commentary to the first Mishnah, all in one lesson. And Tractate Shabbat, as we're starting today, is the longest tractate there is. Not the longest in terms of Daf Yomi, because the Daf Yomi, of course, follows the number of pages. And the number of pages, the longest is Tractate Bava Batra. However, the reason for this is not because Bava Batra is really longer. Bava Batra is quite a bit shorter than Shabbat. But Bava Batra, Rashi died without finishing his commentary on Bava Batra. And most of Bava Batra, the commentary that's printed alongside the Gemara, is of Rashbam, the grandson of Rashi. And Rashbam tended to do a lot of pilpul. He was one of Balei Tosafot already, and his commentary is more similar to Tosafot. So therefore, the pages of the Gemara are much shorter, since there is a much longer commentary on each page. And that's why the relatively short Gemara of Bava Batra, it's a long Gemara, it's not really short, but it's about the same as Bava Metzia. But the number of dafs, the number of pages that it took is much longer. So that's how it just happened to be that Bava Batra is the longest tractate in terms of number of pages, without being actually the longest in terms of the number of words or the number of prakim or the concepts. But the longest Gemara in terms of the number of words or the number of prakim, of chapters, that's Shabbat. Interestingly, that Shabbat, Yerushalmi Talmud did not finish, apparently, or didn't come to us, the part on the last few prakim. So it's only on like the first large portion of Shabbat, more than 2/3, but not the entire Shabbat has Yerushalmi. But Babylonian Talmud on Shabbat is full. It covers the entire tractate. And the general structure, it seems, is follows. By the way, Shulchan Aruch also follows the same structure. It first discusses things that we need to know before Shabbat, and then only it gets to the mlachot, the 39 mlochas, the 39 types of labor that are forbidden on Shabbat. That's the 7th perek, Klal Gadol, where it talks about every kind of mlacha, what we cannot do on Shabbat. And then it keeps discussing until the end of the tractate the specific works. Meaning a lot of the ideas in Tractate Shabbat are going to be mentioned in two different places. One is as it relates to Erev Shabbat in some sense, and one is when it gets to after the 7th perek to discuss the specific works. The same way it's in Shulchan Aruch. For example, if you want to know the laws of Bishul, the laws of the prohibition of cooking on Shabbat, there are two different chapters that deal with it. Reish Nun Gimel, 253, and also Shin Yud Chet, 318. Why so? Because first it talks about what you're supposed to do before Shabbat, how you could keep something on the blech, what you're supposed to do in order to leave the food on before Shabbat without breaking Shabbat. And then later it talks about the actual laws of Bishul. But the two types of laws are really overlapping in many different ways. The same thing here. The very first Mishnah is talking about the melacha of carrying. This is going to be in the perek Hazorek. There's a whole perek that deals with the prohibition of carrying. Why is this mentioned here? Why is the first Mishnah talking about it too? The prohibition of moving something from one domain to another. One of the reasons is because we're not talking about Erev Shabbat now, and as it's going to talk about what you're not allowed to have in your pockets as you leave, what you're not allowed to do right before Shabbat starts because of the prohibition of carrying. So it therefore mentions a general law of what's considered carrying. But it's going to go on and talk about these types of things in much greater detail in a different perek. So the whole Tractate Shabbat therefore could be split between two different parts in a sense. A lot of tractates, by the way, in our Mishnah and in the Talmud, start with the most fundamental concept. So you'd think that Shabbat should start with Klal Gadol, fundamental concept of Shabbat, but it does not, because first it wants to deal with Erev Shabbat. So this tractate is an exclusion. It first deals with, up to the 7th chapter, with the Erev Shabbat. It talks about the melacha of carrying a little bit because of what you're not allowed to wear, since you might be wearing something already outside when Shabbat starts. So that's why you have to know these laws. And also about the animals, what they cannot have on their backs, what would be considered for them, the kind of your animal doing work. And there will be a whole chapter before that with regards to how to keep the food before Shabbat. Again, the very thing I discussed in Shulchan Aruch, Reish Nun Gimel, the laws of how to put food to keep it hot before Shabbat. But later there will be prakim that deal with the actual laws, the 39 forbidden labor types that will be discussed in detail. So the first Mishnah tells us a general principle of carrying from one domain to the other. And the example given is there is a poor man standing outside and a rich man standing inside the house, and they're transferring something from one domain to another. So the general law is if there are two people doing one full mlacha, neither of them is chayav. Each one did half the work, and therefore each one is prohibited from doing this, but he does not have a chiyuv. What does it mean, chayav? Chayav means that he broke Shabbat fully, in the sense that if he did it accidentally, he would have to bring a korban in the times of the temple. If he does it purposefully, he gets karet and he's chayav mita if there would be witnesses who warn him. So that's the worst kind of prohibitions. Shabbat, of course, is extremely important, and the Torah assigns the worst punishments for breaking Shabbat deliberately. Now in practice, it was almost never administered. It's very difficult for a person, according to Jewish law, to get punished by death, to get a death sentence. But at least theoretically, the Torah tells you how important it is and assigns the most strict punishment for breaking Shabbat. So in theory, even such a minor mlacha that you might think, well, that's not labor, what's the big deal? I just put something from one domain to another. I'm not tired from that. But this is also mlacha. It's a very easy mlacha. In fact, the Tosafot talks about here that, according to them, this is one of the reasons to start with this mlacha. It's a mlacha gerua, kind of thing that a lot of people might not think it's mlacha at all. It's not a big deal. You just took out something from the house, put it into the house. But it's considered a mlacha, as long as it's one person doing the entire mlacha. But if each one did half, then they both are wrong. What they did was prohibited, but they do not get a chiyuv. So that's the main gist of this Mishnah that we're summarizing now. That if a person standing outside takes something and puts inside into the hand of somebody standing inside, he broke Shabbat completely. But if he just stretches his hand with an object inside and the person standing inside, the rich man here, takes that object from his hand, so each one did half the work. Similarly, the opposite. If the person standing inside takes an object outside, but it's the poor man who takes from his hand now, then each one did half the work. But if it's the rich man who puts in the hand of the poor man a coin, let's say, or anything, then he's the one who broke the entire Shabbat, and he is chayav. And on this Mishnah, there's a lot of different discussions, and they're mostly technical. That's why I don't want to stop at this. I don't want to make many small lessons on each daf. I'm going to just summarize these technical discussions. As I mentioned before, my lessons here are not, their purpose is not to substitute for Daf Yomi, but those who don't do Daf Yomi anyway, at least they'll be sort of with the people who are doing Daf Yomi, a little bit. And those who do Daf Yomi, for them it might be a good review. Or if they're going to listen to this lesson now, then it's going to be instead a preface. Before they will actually learn all these laws in detail, they will know at least approximately what the discussions are. So for instance, there are concepts that have to do with putting something on something that has 4 by 4 tfachim, like a minimal size on something on which you put, or the opposite, taking from something. When does this apply? Whether it's in Reshut Harabim or where? What are the situations? Trees with their branches. What's the status of those? And to understand a lot of these Gemaras, you have to know the general principle, which is discussed actually in the Sugya too, but a little bit further down, towards Daf 6. It gets to this very important concept of what's considered various reshuyot. It's probably the most fundamental concept. You know how there is this fundamental theorem of arithmetic, fundamental theorem of algebra, fundamental theorem of calculus, and everything. There's something the most fundamental. So the most fundamental concept in terms of carrying, you have to know there are 4 reshuyot. In a sense, from the Torah, there's only 3, as the guy explains, but one is split between, the rabbi split it into 2. And so there are 4 reshuyot, ultimately. 4 kinds of domains. One is called Reshut HaYachid, like my house, for instance, but it doesn't have to be a house, it doesn't have to have a roof. Even just something that's surrounded by a wall, surrounded by a fence. If the fence is 10 tfachim high, about a meter or a little bit less, right? About 3 feet high approximately. When you have something surrounded by a fence, that's Reshut HaYachid. Or even just something standing, even if you, on the street you have like a wardrobe, some kind of closet standing, or even a big table sometimes. Anything can become Reshut HaYachid if it has the right size. So Reshut HaYachid is where you're allowed to carry inside of that. But you cannot carry from that to Reshut Rabim. And now what's Reshut Rabim? The biblical Reshut Rabim is only places, not just outside, not just any street or any kind of plaza or any kind of forest or other outside places. It has to have certain conditions to be fully Reshut Rabim. It's basically large places made for gathering or for passing of large numbers of people. There is an opinion that you need 600,000 people passing in order for it to be Reshut Rabim. The Talmud doesn't mention that opinion explicitly, and a lot of Rishonim do not agree with it. The Shulchan Aruch brings this as a Yesh Omrim, that some think that this is a condition. But one of the conditions mentioned is it has to be large enough. It cannot be like a narrow street. Even if a lot of people pass in a narrow street, in most cases it's not going to be Reshut Rabim. So it has to be wide enough. It has to have a possibility for people passing. It cannot have a roof, of course. Something that's covered by a roof obviously is not Reshut Rabim. Places like sea or forests and other places where there's usually few people and it's not really made for transpassing as much, those are not Reshut Rabim. Generally, Reshut Rabim are either big streets or big plazas. If you have a city that's surrounded by a wall and its doors close, in old times, a lot of cities were surrounded by a wall. Most big cities were surrounded by a wall, and the doors used to close at night. So in those types of cities, there is no Reshut Rabim. There are opinions that in certain cases, a plaza inside the city might be Reshut Rabim anyway, but we're not going to go into this right now. The basic idea is that Reshut Rabim is open spaces that are not surrounded by any walls and not covered by any roof, and where people can pass easily in large numbers, possibly 600,000 people, and possibly this is not one of the conditions, and it's just a lot of people can pass and have easy access to those things. So places like, let's say, large cities today, New York, are they Reshut Rabim or not? So there are a lot of disputes about it. Is there such a thing as Reshut Rabim in New York City? Many disputes exist with regards to this. Manhattan in particular seems to be surrounded by sort of a wall, right? Because near the water, Manhattan is always surrounded. You don't want people falling into the water, so it is surrounded by a wall. But there are bridges, there are tunnels. Does that make Reshut Rabim no longer Reshut Rabim? There are all kinds of disputes. There are also questions about the subway lines above the ground in Brooklyn and other places where they kind of split the city into smaller areas. Do we say that they actually make it biblically no longer Reshut Rabim? Another question might be with regards to the street lights, traffic lights. Even though they don't have actual mechitza, there's no wall there, but it's a virtual mechitza of sorts. That each time there's a red light, you cannot go through. In a way, maybe that creates already enough of a reason for it not to be Reshut Rabim in that place. So all kinds of questions abound, and there are opinions that we have Reshut Rabim in places in Brooklyn and Queens and Manhattan possibly, or possibly there is no Reshut Rabim at all. Now, what are the other two Reshuyot? So I said Reshut HaYachid is basically a house or a yard, a garden that's surrounded, a place that's surrounded by walls. Reshut Rabim is a public place that's not surrounded by anything. There are also two in-betweens. Biblically, there's only one, but the Chazal split it into two. One is called Carmelit. That's something similar to Reshut Rabim, but that's lacking certain conditions to make it fully Reshut Rabim. So, for example, if according to those opinions that you need 600,000, right? So any large street that doesn't have 600,000, that would be a Carmelit. According to other opinions, that might still be Reshut Rabim. But if the street is not straight or other conditions are not met, or certainly places where few people pass, like forests and sea, all those places are Carmelit. So basically, Carmelit, biblically, you could carry from it to a house or to Reshut Rabim. But the rabbis forbid it. And it's generally accepted that in Carmelit you're allowed to make a virtual Eruv, meaning just to make the rope that goes on top of poles, and that's what we call Eruv today. It's really called Surat HaPetach, technically. Eruv is what mixes the domains. It's a piece of bread or food that mixes the people's domains so you could carry inside. But the Surat HaPetach is these virtual mechitzot, virtual walls. And that's what's done in many big cities, relying that Midoraita, biblically, this place is not Rishut Rabim, and therefore you could make a virtual wall to allow carrying inside. But if there is Rishut Rabim, generally it's accepted that then these virtual mechitzot, the Surat HaPetach, will not be helpful. That's why some people carry by there, some people don't. There are other reasons. I'm trying to simplify things here. And there is also a fourth type of Rishut called Makom Patur. It's basically a tiny area, less than 4 by 4 tefachim. Tefach is a handbreadth. So we're talking about something of the order of between 36 and 40 centimeters or so, 4 tefachim. Right? So something that's less than that, some maybe fire hydrant or something. Those are the types of things that are Makom Patur. From them you could carry to Rishut Rabim or to Rishut Yachid. Now, inside Rishut Rabim, you're not allowed to carry 4 amot. Even if you're not taking something from the house to the street or from the street to the house, right? You're just moving something on the street itself. Once you moved it for 4 amot, you broke Shabbat. But there are also discussions exactly how to count these 4 amot. Turns out to be a diagonal of a square of 4 amot. It's more complex than that. But basically, if you walk a few feet carrying something, you break Shabbat. But there's another condition. It has to be that the person did both Akira and Hanacha. You have, in order to break Shabbat, a person would have to pick something up and put it down, or at least stand, to rest. That's also like putting things down. But if, for instance, he was working from before Shabbat didn't start yet, and he was already working with his stuff, with maybe his bag full of stuff, then if he now runs as Shabbat is starting, he never really did the first half of the work, in a sense. So in certain cases, it allowed him to run Erev Shabbat, and just to throw it into his house in an unusual manner, the thing that he was carrying. Is one allowed to carry always outside less than 4 amot? Meaning, carry a little bit and rest a little bit and carry a little bit more. The answer is it's only in various very unusual circumstances that they permitted this. The sages generally didn't want you to carry each time less than this amount. And at any rate, this would only work when you're in Rishut Rabim. Once you enter the house, even if it's a few inches that you carried, you just took something from outside and put it inside the house, you already broke Shabbat. It doesn't matter how little is the distance, because you're never allowed to bring something from outside to inside, or vice versa. That's the general ideas that this Gemaras discuss. And the more details, of course, is for you to learn the actual sugyas with Rashi, or to listen to Daf Yomi, to those Rabbanim that give full shiur on these topics. And if you like this video, please press like. And on next video in a few days, we're going to continue with Hashem on Daf Tet, on Daf 9. The Mishnah will talk about what you're not allowed to do close to Shabbat. Everything here, it's not really even close to Shabbat specifically. It discusses close to Mincha, but it's a similar idea that you're not allowed to start long processes, long procedures that will possibly drag when the time is close to the prayer of Mincha. And please subscribe to our channel.